And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth, where many of us believe that the greatest threat to this greatest nation involves the threat of Islamo-Nazi terror, the ongoing desire on the part of, literally tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, to strike at the United States, to wreck the United States, to harm the United States, to kill our people and ruin our economy. Yeah, it seems like a serious thing to me, but there is a new book that makes a fascinating case. It really is a challenging case that we're wrong to feel so concerned, that we're wrong to focus so much energy and money and human lives in trying to protect this country against terrorism. Professor John Mueller says we would be better off accepting, absorbing some minor terrorism attacks. And he also suggests that a big attack like 9/11 is very, very unlikely. Professor Mueller, thanks very much for joining us. Is he there?
Yes, I'm here. Are you?
Oh, great, yeah. Great. Glad that you're there. The book is called Overblown, How Politicians and the Terrorism Industry Inflate National Security Threats and Why We Believe Them. Speaking of which, let me begin by reading a series of quotations from Mayor Giuliani, who's campaigning for president. And Newsweek reports that he was campaigning for president in North Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he said, America's struggle is far from over. The terrorists who tested our nation that morning are still plotting to destroy our spirit. I won't use the word if to talk about future attacks. I think probably the way I have to say it is when we're attacked. That's the only way we're going to be safe. We're going to be in this war for quite some time, Giuliani concluded, not by our choosing, but by theirs. Is he wrong?
No, I agree with probably most of that, except in the matter of nuance. I think there is a threat out there. I think there are bad guys out there. I just don't think that they're an existential threat to the United States, that the United States' survival is at stake. I think it's a relatively limited problem in all probability, and the amount of damage they're likely to be able to do is likely to be fairly containable and something we can deal with. I'm very much in favor of policing to try to get these guys before they can do anything if possible. But generally speaking, since 9/11, the amount of damage that's been done outside of war zones by the Muslim extremists, who seem to be a fringe group of a fringe group, has been really pretty limited. Maybe 200 people a year, including Bali and London and all those places. Obviously, that's 200 too many, but it's not exactly an existential threat to much of anything. And it seems to some degree to be in decline. But I'm certainly not saying it's not going to happen again and there's never going to be any problems. The title of the book is Overblown, not non-existent. So it is something to keep an eye on, but not to get hysterical about, it seems to me.
1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. I think one of the most controversial aspects of your book, Professor Mueller, is your assertion that 9/11 was one of a kind, that they are very unlikely, that the terrorists who do wish to harm the United States are very unlikely to be able to repeat an attack on this scale. What about all the material that we hear about dirty bombs and chemical weapons, biological weapons, even suitcase nuclear weapons? Overblown?
Yeah, mostly, I think. I don't say that. I think it'd be very difficult for them to do so. And I think it's fairly unlikely, but bad things have happened. And conceivably something that terrible could happen again, I think is rather unlikely. In the case of suitcase bombs, the nuclear weapons issue, of course, is an important one, and I advocate efforts to try to minimize that as much as possible. Though much of the evidence about suitcase bombs is very questionable. The people who say that they could get some, it's not all clear the suitcase bombs even exist. Biological weapons are very difficult to put together and to control. The agents tend to decay over time. The fact that they've virtually never been used before is some indication of their lack of effectiveness. Chemical weapons basically aren't weapons of mass destruction. In World War I, is something like 0.7% of all the battle deaths were caused by chemical weapons. You can kill people with those weapons, but killing them massively is very questionable. In the case of radiation bombs, what they would do is raise the radiation level in a limited area higher than we might want, and we may need to evacuate, and that would be a major problem. But they wouldn't really kill anybody. They would simply raise the chance of getting cancer if you stayed in the same place for 40 years by perhaps 1/10 or 1/100th of 1%. So that people really refer to those more as weapons of mass disruption than mass destruction.
All right, let me make clear that having looked at your book, Overblown, it is not a don't worry, be happy book. You do recognize that there are threats to the United States. It's just that you don't believe, as you have said repeatedly, that they're existential threats. You write in your book, just about any damage terrorists are likely to be able to perpetrate can be readily absorbed. To deem that threat an existential one is somewhere between extravagant and absurd. What about this idea? I had a very chilling conversation with somebody who is involved in the counter-terror world rather prominently, who said that one of the things that keeps them up at night is the idea of 20 coordinated attacks on shopping centers, just people coming in Columbine style and shooting with semi-automatic weapons and killing people at random. And the reason that would be so devastating, at least according to some of the expectations of the people charged with protecting us, is because it could cause an economic collapse. It could cause people to cower in their homes.
Yes.
Do you minimize, or do you think that they're wrong to recognize the fear factor and all of that?
No, in fact, I stress that very much. The problem with terrorism is not what the terrorists do often, but rather the reaction to terrorism. So therefore, one of the main points that I'm trying to develop in the book is that we have to worry about ourselves. That if you talk about 20 shootings in 20 malls, that would obviously be terribly horrible, but it would not necessarily involve a huge number of deaths. But if it causes the economy to collapse, that was because we do it to ourselves. And my concern is that when people talk about existential threats, what they're talking about is not what the terrorists would do, but what we would do in reaction. People talk about that if they could kill 10,000, it would do away with our way of life. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that a couple of years ago. Well, killing 10,000 people in one day would obviously be an unbelievably horrible thing, the worst thing that ever happened to this country in that short period of time since the Civil War. But the only way it could do away with our way of life would be if we did it to ourselves in response. So what they're suggesting is it's not only the terrorists who are suicidal, but we are. That if we get this horrible hit, what we're going to do is tear up the Bill of Rights, cease to function economically. I don't know what else you have to give up hamburgers, close down churches, and learn North Korean. I don't know what that means, but anyway, it just seems to be. The warning is really not about what the terrorists would do, but what we would do in extravagant overreaction.
Let's go to our callers, to Todd in Atlanta. You're on the Michael Medved Show with Professor John Mueller, author of Overblown.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to ask you if you've taken into consideration the genocide in the Sudan, the situation with Israel, and the fact that Islam's teachings, Islam's history is all about conquest. I mean, Constantinople, is now Istanbul. And I was just wondering if you've taken into consideration, Islam itself. I mean, this is a war of attrition. This is death by 1,000 slices. Yeah,
well, you can say that the same. The history of conquest has also been the history of a lot of Christianity, going back to the old days, too. What you need to look at is who these guys are, how strong they are, and what they're able to do. As I mentioned earlier, the amount of death and destruction they've been able to wreak outside of war zones since 9/11 has been really pretty limited. Moreover, 9/11 in many respects was counterproductive from the standpoint of the Al-Qaeda types. Many Islamic radicals and violent Islamic types basically thought it was really stupid as well as immoral to hit the United States. Furthermore, much of their damage that they've done since 9/11 has been incredibly counterproductive. A good case in point is when they bombed a hotel wedding in Jordan at the end of 2005.
Yeah, but what about their attack in Madrid, which led to the Zapatero government and led to a whole change in Madrid's policy, the withdrawal of Spanish troops from Iraq? They seemed to get exactly what they wanted by blowing up 200 people on trains in Spain.
Yeah, that's right, they did. And that was partly because of the peculiarities of the election and the way the conservative government handled it and so forth. Yeah, I think that was one of their major successes. But in the case of the Jordan thing, let me just quickly finish that. There was a poll before the Jordan bombing in which about 25% of Jordanians had a warm and cuddly feeling about Osama bin Laden. After those bombings, it went down to less than 1%. And what's been happening is, Osama bin Laden is not only against the United States or against the West. He's against virtually everybody else in the world as well. Not only Israel, but Egypt, Saudi Arabia is his big number one target. Russia, India, you pick it.
And
so
Jordan,
they have a big incentive to go after him as well.
1-800-955-1776, our phone number. John Mueller is a professor at Ohio State University, and he holds the Woody Hayes Chair of National Security Studies, named after the football coach, I take it?
You bet.
Okay, you're going to explain how National Security Studies gets named after a football coach at Ohio State. He'll also explain his contention that we worry too much about Islamo-Nazi terrorism. Our fears, in fact, are overblown. His book is posted on our website.